The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram airfield like a knife through fabric. Master Sergeant Rodriguez pressed his headset tighter against his ear, straining to catch the fragmented transmission bleeding through the white noise. What he heard made his blood freeze in his veins. Mayday, Mayday, Viper 77, taking heavy fire, seals are pinned. The voice belonged to Captain Zara Firebird Nakamura, call sign that had earned more eye rolls than respect in the briefing rooms. The brass had given her the name mockingly after she'd requested close air support assignments others deemed too risky. Now that same voice was breaking apart across the airways, swallowed by interference, and what sounded like the distinctive whistle of surface-to-air missiles cutting through Afghan mountain air. Rodriguez bolted upright in his chair, coffee spilling across incident reports that suddenly seemed insignificant. Through the control tower's reinforced windows, he could see the first pale threads of dawn painting the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of amber and blood orange. Somewhere in those jagged peaks, a team of Navy SEALs was fighting for their lives, and the only thing standing between them and certain death was a pilot most of the base considered a liability. The transmission cut to dead silence. Rodriguez's fingers flew across his radio console, cycling through frequencies, desperate to re-establish contact. Firebird 77, Bagram Tower, do you copy? Firebird 77, please respond. Nothing but the empty hiss of electromagnetic void filled his headset. In the distance, a C-130 Hercules was taxiing for morning patrol, its four turboprops creating a low harmonic that seemed to vibrate through the control tower's steel framework. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison burst through the tower door, still buttoning his flight jacket, gray stubble catching the fluorescent light. His weathered face carried the kind of tension that comes from 23 years of military service and too many friends' names carved into black granite. Rodriguez, what's the situation? Lost contact with Firebird 77 approximately 90 seconds ago, sir. Last transmission indicated SEALs under heavy fire, requesting immediate close air support. Rodriguez's voice remained steady, professional, but his knuckles were white against the radio controls. Operation Serpent's Edge, Sector 79er Alpha. Harrison's jaw tightened. Operation Serpent's Edge was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, a simple in-and-out mission to gather intelligence on suspected Taliban weapons caches hidden in the Spingar Mountains. The kind of mission they'd run 100 times before. But nothing was ever routine when the mountains themselves seemed to harbor death in every shadow, when every ridge could conceal RPG teams, when every valley might become a kill zone. Get me satellite imagery of Sector 79er Alpha now, Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd seen too many good soldiers disappear into those unforgiving peaks. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to human struggles unfolding in its light. The mystery had begun with silence, and silence, they both knew, was often the precursor to tragedy in Afghanistan's brutal theater of war. Captain Zara Nakamura had always been an anomaly in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone at Bagram Airfield. At 5'4" with delicate features that belonged more in a literature classroom than a combat zone, she cut an unlikely figure against the massive bulk of the Warthog. The A-10's twin turbofan engines, mounted high on the fuselage, seemed to dwarf her during pre-flight inspections, and more than one ground crew member had made jokes about needing a stepladder to help her reach the cockpit. But those who'd served with her longer knew better than to judge by appearances. Nakamura had grown up in rural Oregon, daughter of a Japanese-American father who'd been interned during World War II, and a mother who'd taught her that proving yourself meant outworking everyone else in the room. She joined the Air Force at 18, driven by something deeper than patriotism, a need to demonstrate that strength wasn't measured in inches or pounds, but in the steadiness of hands on flight controls and the clarity of decision-making under pressure. Her call sign, Firebird, had started as an insult. During her first deployment to Afghanistan, she'd volunteered for every dangerous close air support mission that came across the assignment board. The other pilots, mostly men with names like Bulldog and Hammer, had whispered that she was trying to prove something, that she'd get herself and others killed with her reckless eagerness. They'd called her Firebird sarcastically, suggesting she'd burn out quickly like the mythical creature, consumed by her own flames. What they hadn't expected was for her to excel. Mission after mission, Nakamura had threaded the needle between friendly forces and enemy positions with surgical precision. Her GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the 7-barrel monster that formed the A-10 spine, had saved more American lives than anyone cared to count. The 30 depleted uranium rounds she delivered with mathematical precision had turned the tide in firefights across Helmand Province, Kandahar, and now here in the treacherous mountains along the Pakistani border. This morning's mission had begun like dozens of others. SEAL Team 7 required close air support for a reconnaissance operation in the Spingar Range, investigating reports of weapons caches in caves that honeycombed the mountainsides like ancient burial chambers. Intelligence suggested light resistance, maybe a few scattered Taliban fighters with small arms, the kind of mission that should have been routine. Nakamura had reviewed the briefing materials with her characteristic attention to detail. Terrain maps spread across her small desk showed elevation changes that could hide entire armies, valleys where radio signals died, ridgelines that offered perfect shooting positions for anyone patient enough to wait. She traced potential approach vectors with her finger, calculating angles of attack, egress routes, and dead zones where her A-10 would be most vulnerable to ground fire. The pre-dawn briefing had been standard procedure. Weather favorable, visibility good, rules of engagement clearly defined. SEAL Team 7 would insert via helicopter at coordinates previously scouted by drone surveillance. Nakamura would provide overwatch from altitude, ready to deliver precision strikes if the situation escalated. What none of them had anticipated was the sophisticated nature of the trap waiting in those mountains. The first indication of trouble had come when SEAL Team 7 reported movement that didn't match their intelligence briefings. Instead of a handful of fighters, thermal imaging was revealing dozens of heat signatures positioned at strategic points throughout the valley. What should have been a simple reconnaissance had become a carefully orchestrated ambush, and the SEALs found themselves surrounded by an enemy that had been waiting for them. That's when the radio had gone silent, leaving only questions and the growing certainty that something had gone very, very wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan. In the control tower at Bagram, tension thick as desert dust filled the air as Rodriguez continued cycling through radio frequencies, searching for any trace of Firebird 77's transmission. The satellite imagery Harrison had requested was coming online, revealing the stark geography of Sector 79 Alpha in high-resolution detail. The Spingar Mountains stretched across the screen like a moonscape, all sharp ridges and deep shadows, terrain that had swallowed armies for millennia. There, Harrison pointed to a cluster of thermal signatures scattered across a valley floor. That's got to be our SEALs. Even through the digital imagery, it was clear they were pinned down, taking fire from elevated positions that commanded excellent fields of fire. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and without close air support, SEAL Team 7 would be systematically picked apart by fighters who knew every rock, every cave, every approach route in those mountains. Rodriguez adjusted his headset, trying once more to raise Nakamura. Firebird 77, Bagram Tower, if you can hear this transmission, be advised friendly forces are located at grid 774921. Say again, friendlies at grid 774921. His voice carried across empty airwaves, unanswered prayers broadcasted into the thin mountain air. Major Thompson from the intelligence section arrived with updated threat assessments that made their situation even more grim. Sir, we're seeing sophisticated communication intercepts from the target area. This wasn't random contact. They were expecting us. Someone leaked the operation details, or they've been watching our patrol patterns long enough to predict where we'd insert. Harrison studied the tactical display, his experienced eyes reading the terrain like a familiar book written in contour lines and elevation markers. The SEALs were caught in what military tacticians called a kill sack, a predetermined zone where every approach and egress route was covered by interlocking fields of fire. It was a professional setup, the kind of ambush that required weeks of preparation and detailed knowledge of American operational procedures. "What about other aircraft in the area?" Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer. The morning patrol schedule showed their nearest assets were 40 minutes away, and 40 minutes might as well be 40 hours when soldiers were taking fire from multiple directions. "Negative, sir. Firebird 77 is our only close air support asset in range." Rodriguez's response confirmed what everyone in the tower already understood. If Nakamura couldn't reach those SEALs, no one could. The mathematics of time and distance, fuel and ammunition, had reduced their options to a single A-10 Thunderbolt II somewhere in the mountains, flown by a pilot many still considered unproven despite her growing reputation. Through the control tower windows, the morning sun climbed higher above the Afghanistan landscape, casting long shadows across Bagram's runways. Somewhere in those mountains, brave men were fighting for their lives, and their only hope wore the call sign of a mythical bird that was supposed to rise from its own ashes. The question now was whether Captain Zara Nakamura could live up to the legend her call sign implied, or whether this morning would see both the SEALs and their guardian angel consumed by the same flames. The silence from Sector 79 Alpha stretched longer with each passing second, and everyone in that control tower understood that silence, in combat zones, usually meant someone wasn't coming home. 47 minutes earlier, Captain Nakamura had felt the familiar pre-mission calm settle over her as she completed her walk-around inspection of the A-10. The Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a mechanical predator, its distinctive twin-engine configuration and massive GAU-8 cannon giving it an unmistakably lethal appearance. The aircraft's titanium bathtub, armor plating designed to protect the pilot from ground fire, gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, scarred but intact from previous missions. She'd run her hands along the aircraft's surfaces, checking for loose panels, examining the condition of hardpoints where Maverick missiles hung like deadly ornaments. The A-10 wasn't pretty by conventional standards, but it was built for one purpose: keeping American ground forces alive when situations turned desperate. Every rivet, every armor plate, every redundant system had been designed by engineers who understood that close air support meant flying low, slow, and directly into harm's way. The pre-flight briefing had covered standard procedures for overwatch operations. SEAL Team 7 would insert via MH-60 Black Hawk at dawn, investigate suspected weapons caches in caves that intelligence believed were lightly defended, and extract before midday heat made flying conditions more challenging. Nakamura's job was to orbit at Angel's 15,000 feet, ready to provide precision fires if the situation required intervention. She'd studied the target area extensively, memorizing terrain features that could affect her approach angles. The Spingar Mountains presented unique challenges for close air support: sudden elevation changes that could hide surface-to-air missiles, valleys where radio communications became intermittent, and terrain so rugged that distinguishing friendly forces from enemy fighters required split-second decision-making at high stress levels. The flight out had been routine. Her A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines had carried her smoothly through morning thermals, and she'd established communication with SEAL Team 7 as they began their insertion. "Overwatch established," she'd reported, watching through her targeting pod as the Black Hawk deposited 8 operators into what appeared to be an empty valley. "Firebird 77 on station, ready to provide close air support as required." The first 30 minutes had passed without incident. Through her targeting systems, she'd watched the SEALs move methodically toward their objectives, their thermal signatures bright against cool mountain stone. They'd cleared several cave entrances, finding evidence of recent weapons storage but encountering no resistance. It had seemed like dozens of similar missions she'd flown, routine reconnaissance that would end with intelligence gathered and everyone returning safely to base. The first indication of trouble had been subtle, movement signatures appearing on her thermal imaging that hadn't been there moments before. At first, she'd attributed them to wildlife or thermal shadows cast by warming rock surfaces. But as she'd studied the patterns more carefully, she'd realized she was looking at human figures moving with tactical precision through terrain that provided natural concealment. "Overwatch to ground Team 7, she transmitted. "I'm seeing multiple movement signatures at various positions around your location. Recommend increased vigilance." Her voice had remained calm, professional, but internally she'd begun running calculations, distances to targets, ammunition loads, egress routes if the situation deteriorated rapidly. SEAL Team 7's response had confirmed her growing suspicion that this mission was about to become significantly more complicated than anyone had anticipated. They'd begun taking sporadic sniper fire from multiple directions, suggesting they'd walked into a carefully prepared ambush. The weapons caches they'd been sent to investigate hadn't been abandoned. They'd been bait in a trap that was now closing around 8 of America's most elite warriors. That's when everything had changed, and routine reconnaissance had transformed into a desperate fight for survival in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The moment SEAL Team 7 reported taking fire, Captain Nakamura's training took over with the mechanical precision of a Swiss timepiece. She pushed her A-10 into a steep dive, descending from 15,000 feet to 8,000 feet in less than 90 seconds, her airspeed building toward the edge of her aircraft's operational envelope. The Thunderbolt II groaned under the stress, but its robust construction handled the aggressive maneuvering without complaint. Ground Team 7, Firebird 7-7 descending for close air support. Mark your positions with IR strobes and take cover. Her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, years of training overriding the natural human response to mortal danger. Through her canopy, the mountainous terrain rushed upward with alarming speed, ridge lines and valleys becoming more distinct as she closed the distance between herself and the firefight below. The SEAL team leader's response crackled through her headset. Firebird were taking accurate sniper fire from multiple positions. Count at least 15 muzzle flashes on the ridgeline bearing 270 degrees from our position. We're pinned down behind rock outcropping, cannot maneuver. Nakamura activated her targeting pod, the sophisticated sensor package immediately beginning to paint detailed thermal images on her multifunction display. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The SEALs were surrounded by a textbook ambush formation, fighters positioned at key terrain features with overlapping fields of fire, probably equipped with night vision and communications equipment that suggested this wasn't a random encounter with local Taliban fighters. This was a professional military operation. Copy Ground Team 7. I have visual on your IR markers. Danger close fire missions authorized. She was already selecting 30 high-explosive rounds for her GAU-8 cannon, calculating approach vectors that would bring her close enough for accurate fire without risking friendly casualties. Danger close meant firing within 600 meters of friendly forces, close enough that a slight miscalculation could result in fratricide. Affirmative, Firebird. We're combat effective but cannot maneuver. You are cleared hot, danger close. The SEAL team leader's voice carried the controlled desperation of a professional warrior who understood that close air support was now their only chance of survival. Nakamura rolled her aircraft into a diving attack run, her world narrowing to the targeting reticle on her heads-up display and the radio chatter flowing through her headset. At this altitude, she could hear small arms fire echoing off the mountain walls, The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the heavier reports of what sounded like Dragunov sniper rifles. The enemy wasn't just numerous. They were well-equipped and disciplined enough to maintain fire discipline while under attack from close air support. Her first gun run was surgical, a 3-second burst from the GAU-8 that sent depleted uranium rounds into a cluster of muzzle flashes on the eastern ridgeline. The massive cannon shook her aircraft like an earthquake, and through her targeting pod, she watched enemy positions disappear in explosions of rock and dust. But instead of breaking contact, the remaining fighters adjusted their positions and continued engaging the pinned SEALs with automatic weapons fire. Good hits, Firebird. You got at least 3 of them, but we're still taking fire from the north and west positions. The SEAL team leader's update confirmed what Nakamura's tactical display was showing her. This was going to require multiple attack runs in terrain that offered enemy fighters numerous hiding places and excellent defensive positions. She pulled her A-10 up and around for another approach, already calculating fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure. The mathematics of combat aviation were unforgiving. Every minute in the target area burned fuel she'd need to return to base, and every round she fired brought her closer to the moment when she'd have nothing left to offer the ground team below. The morning sun continued its relentless climb above the Hindu Kush, indifferent to the life-and-death struggle unfolding in its growing light. As Nakamura set up for her second attack run, the tactical situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. The SEAL team was reporting casualties, not killed, but wounded badly enough that their mobility was becoming increasingly compromised. Through her targeting pod, she could see the bright thermal signatures of the operators pressed against rocks that provided minimal cover from the crossfire, now raking their position from 3 directions. Firebird 7-7, be advised we have 1 urgent surgical and 2 routine casualties. We need immediate extraction but cannot reach landing zone under current fire. The SEAL team leader's voice remained professional, but Nakamura could hear the strain underneath. In military terminology, urgent surgical meant someone was bleeding internally or had injuries that would prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. She keyed her radio while lining up on a cluster of muzzle flashes along the western ridge. Copy, Ground Team 7. I'm engaging western positions now. Keep your heads down. Her second gun run was longer, a sustained burst that walked 30 rounds across suspected enemy positions like deadly stepping stones. The GAU-8's distinctive BRRRT sound echoed off the mountain walls, a mechanical growl that announced the presence of American close air support. But as she pulled off target, her aircraft shuddered under the impact of ground fire. Warning lights illuminated her instrument panel in angry reds and ambers, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems showing irregularities, fuel flow indicators fluctuating. The Taliban fighters weren't just well-positioned. They were equipped with heavy machine guns and possibly shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that could turn her A-10 into a falling torch. Firebird, you're trailing smoke. The urgent transmission came from the SEAL team leader, who had a clear view of her aircraft as it climbed away from the target area. Say your status. Nakamura quickly scanned her instruments, running emergency checklists with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd trained for this moment her entire career. The A-10 was built to absorb battle damage and continue flying, but there were limits to what even the most robust aircraft could endure. She had 2 choices: break off the attack and return to base for emergency landing procedures, or continue supporting the ground team with a damaged aircraft that might not survive another pass through the enemy's engagement envelope. Through her headset, she could hear the ongoing firefight below, automatic weapons fire, the sharp crack of sniper rifles, and underneath it all, the disciplined radio calls of American warriors fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. The wounded SEAL needed immediate medical attention, and the entire team needed close air support to break contact with an enemy that showed no signs of retreating or running out of ammunition. The decision required no deliberation. Ground Team 7, Firebird 77 still mission capable. I'm making another attack run on the northern positions. Stay low and mark your position with IR strobes. Her voice carried none of the uncertainty she felt about her aircraft's condition. Some decisions transcended personal safety, and this was one of them. She banked her damaged A-10 around for what might be her final attack run, knowing that the mountains of Afghanistan had already claimed too many good people, and she had no intention of letting them claim 8 more if she could prevent it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across terrain that had witnessed countless acts of courage and sacrifice throughout history. Today would add another chapter to that record, written in the contrails of a wounded Thunderbolt II and the determination of a pilot who had finally found her true call sign's meaning. The third attack run nearly ended Captain Nakamura's war permanently. As she rolled into her dive, a surface-to-air missile launched from a concealed position, its distinctive vapor trail streaking toward her aircraft like a deadly lance. Only her combat experience saved her. She saw the launch signature in her peripheral vision and immediately deployed chaff and flares while pulling into a violent evasive maneuver that stressed her already damaged A-10 beyond its design limits. The missile detonated close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel, spiderwebbing her canopy and destroying several non-essential systems. But the A-10's legendary toughness kept her airborne, and she managed to deliver another devastating gun run that silenced the northern machine gun position that had been causing the most casualties among the pinned SEAL team. Outstanding shooting, Firebird. The enthusiasm in the SEAL team leader's voice was unmistakable. Northern positions are neutralized. We can see daylight through this mess now. But even as he spoke, Nakamura's targeting pod was revealing new thermal signatures moving into positions the SEALs couldn't see from their limited vantage point. The enemy was adapting, reinforcing, preparing to continue the engagement. Her fuel gauges were approaching critical levels, and her ammunition counter showed less than 200 rounds remaining for the GAU-8. In military aviation, these were the numbers that determined when close air support became a mathematical impossibility. She had perhaps 10 minutes of station time remaining before she'd be forced to return to base, leaving the SEALs to face a determined enemy with limited ammunition and at least one critically wounded teammate. Ground Team 7, I'm showing bingo fuel in approximately 10 minutes. Request immediate extraction plan. She hated delivering this information, knowing it placed additional pressure on warriors who were already fighting against overwhelming odds. But fuel exhaustion was a law of physics that no amount of courage could overcome. The response came not from the team leader, but from their medic. Firebird, our urgent surgical won't survive extraction under fire. We need those positions suppressed for medical stabilization before we can move him. The clinical precision of the statement couldn't hide its emotional weight. Someone was dying in those rocks, and their only chance was for Nakamura to buy them enough time to provide life-saving treatment. She studied her tactical display, calculating ammunition expenditure rates against target requirements. 200 rounds of 30 might be enough to suppress the remaining enemy positions long enough for the medic to work, but it would leave her with no reserves for covering the team's extraction. And her damaged aircraft was showing increasing signs of structural stress. Control surface response was becoming sluggish, and several warning lights indicated systems that were on the verge of complete failure. Through her radio, she could hear the sound of medical treatment being conducted under fire, terse instructions from the medic, acknowledgments from other team members, and underneath it all, the labored breathing of someone fighting for life on a mountainside 8,000 miles from home. It was a sound that cut through military training and professional detachment, reaching the part of her that understood why she'd chosen close air support as her specialty. Copy, Ground Team 7. I'm making one final gun run to suppress remaining positions. Use the window for medical treatment. She didn't mention that this would expend her remaining ammunition, or that her aircraft's condition made another pass through the enemy engagement envelope increasingly dangerous. Some information didn't need to be shared with people who had enough to worry about. As she set up for what might be her final attack run, Captain Nakamura found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with her father before deploying to Afghanistan. He told her about his time in the internment camps, about how dignity meant doing the right thing even when the cost was personal. She'd never fully understood what he meant until this moment, when doing the right thing meant risking everything for 8 strangers who were depending on her. The sun continued its climb above the Hindu Kush, and in its growing light, the true meaning of call signs was about to be tested against the unforgiving mathematics of combat aviation. The final gun run was unlike anything Captain Nakamura had ever attempted. With her ammunition nearly exhausted and her aircraft systems failing, she descended to an altitude that brought her within easy range of small arms fire, flying so low that she could see individual fighters scrambling for cover among the rocks. Her targeting pod painted thermal images that revealed at least a dozen enemy positions, still capable of engaging the SEALs, and she knew her remaining ammunition wouldn't eliminate all of them. Instead, she chose precision over quantity, selecting targets that posed the greatest immediate threat to the team's medic. Her final burst from the GAU-8 cannon lasted exactly 4.7 seconds, walking depleted uranium rounds across a cluster of positions that commanded direct fire onto the SEAL's location. The massive cannon fell silent with a mechanical finality that every close air support pilot dreaded, the moment when you had nothing left to give except your presence above the battlefield. Firebird 77, ammunition expended, fuel critical, she transmitted, pulling her damaged A-10 up and away from the target area. Through her cracked canopy, she could see smoke rising from the enemy positions she just engaged, but thermal imaging showed that numerous fighters remained active throughout the valley. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The SEALs were still outnumbered, still pinned down, and their close air support had just run out of ways to help them. Roger Firebird, outstanding support. We can get our man stabilized now, thanks to you. The SEAL team leader's transmission carried gratitude that transcended military protocol, but it also carried an unspoken understanding. They were on their own now, and extraction would depend entirely on their ability to break contact with a determined enemy using only their remaining small arms ammunition. But Captain Nakamura wasn't ready to abandon SEAL Team 7 to face the enemy alone. Her A-10 might be out of ammunition, but it still represented 800 miles per hour of American close air support, and she had an idea that violated every safety regulation in the Air Force manual, while offering the SEALs their best chance of survival. Ground Team 7, I'm remaining on station for escort duties, she transmitted, banking her aircraft around in a wide circle above the valley. What she didn't say was that her plan involved using her A-10 as a psychological weapon, making low passes over enemy positions to convince them that she still posed a lethal threat. It was a desperate gambit that relied on the Taliban fighters not knowing her weapons were expended. Her first escort pass was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Flying at less than 500 feet above ground level, she roared over enemy positions with her engines at maximum power, the distinctive sound of the A-10's twin turbofans echoing off mountain walls like mechanical thunder. Through her targeting pod, she watched fighters dive for cover, their disciplined fire becoming sporadic and poorly aimed as they struggled to track her low-altitude flight path. Jesus, Firebird, they think you're still loaded for bear. The excitement in the SEAL medic's voice was audible even over the sound of ongoing medical treatment. Our patient is stable for transport. We need about 5 more minutes to prepare him for movement. 5 minutes might as well have been 5 hours with her fuel gauges approaching emergency levels and her damaged aircraft showing increasing signs of structural failure. But she had committed to staying, and SEAL Team 7 was counting on her presence to keep enemy heads down long enough to save their wounded teammate's life. As she set up for another psychological warfare pass, Captain Nakamura realized that her call sign had finally found its true meaning. Like the mythical Firebird, she was about to discover whether she could rise from the ashes of an impossible situation, or whether the flames would consume everything she'd worked to protect. The mountains of Afghanistan watched with ancient indifference as courage and desperation played out against the morning sky. Captain Nakamura's second escort pass brought her so low that she could see the whites of enemy fighters' eyes as they scrambled for cover among the rocky outcroppings. Her damaged shook violently as she pulled out of the dive, warning lights illuminating her cockpit like a malevolent Christmas tree. But the psychological effect on the Taliban fighters was exactly what she'd hoped for. Their coordinated fire discipline dissolved into sporadic, poorly aimed shots that posed minimal threat to the SEALs. "Ground Team 7, you have approximately 3 minutes of suppression," she transmitted, pulling her aircraft up and around for what she knew would have to be her final pass. Her fuel gauges were now firmly in the emergency zone, and her flight computer was calculating that she had perhaps 6 minutes of flight time remaining before fuel exhaustion would force a controlled crash, landing somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Through her headset, she could hear the SEAL team preparing their wounded teammate for extraction. The medic's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who understood that the difference between life and death could be measured in heartbeats. "Patient is stable and ready for movement. We're going to bound by teams toward the extraction point. Keep their heads down for another 2 minutes, Firebird." 2 minutes was exactly what her fuel consumption calculations suggested she could provide, assuming her damaged engines continued functioning, and her increasingly erratic flight controls didn't fail completely. It was a mathematical equation written in jet fuel and structural integrity, with 8 American lives hanging in the balance. Her final pass was a masterpiece of desperation and skill. Flying at an altitude that would have resulted in court-martial proceedings under normal circumstances, she threaded her A-10 between mountain peaks, using terrain masking to approach enemy positions from an unexpected direction. The sound of her engines bouncing off canyon walls created an acoustic signature that seemed to come from everywhere at once, adding to the confusion among fighters who were already demoralized by her previous attacks. The ruse worked perfectly. Through her targeting pod, she watched Taliban fighters abandon their positions and flee deeper into the mountains, apparently convinced that this low-flying A-10 was preparing to deliver another devastating gun run. What they couldn't know was that her ammunition counter read exactly 0, and her fuel gauges were approaching the point where controlled flight would become impossible. "Good hunting, Firebird. We're moving toward extraction. Charlie Mike." The SEAL team leader's transmission used the military abbreviation for "continue mission," a professional acknowledgement that their extraction was now their responsibility while she dealt with her own increasingly desperate situation. As Nakamura pulled her A-10 away from the valley, she began running emergency procedures for fuel exhaustion over hostile territory. The nearest friendly airfield was Bagram, approximately 43 minutes away at her current airspeed, and her fuel gauges suggested she had perhaps 4 minutes of engine time remaining. The mathematics were unforgiving. She was going to crash somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, and her only choice was whether it would be a controlled crash or an uncontrolled one. But she had accomplished her mission. SEAL Team 7 was moving toward their extraction point under cover of the confusion she'd created, their wounded teammates stable and transportable thanks to the time she'd bought them with ammunition she didn't have. Sometimes victory in combat wasn't measured in enemy casualties or tactical objectives secured, but in American lives saved by someone willing to risk everything for strangers who were counting on her. The morning sun continued climbing above the Hindu Kush, and Captain Zara Nakamura prepared to discover whether the Firebird could truly rise from its own ashes, or whether some flames burned so bright they consumed everything, including the bird itself. Her radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Firebird 77, this is Texaco 21. Inbound your position for emergency aerial refueling. The fuel crisis that should have ended Captain Nakamura's war had been observed by a KC-135 Stratotanker crew conducting routine operations over the Afghan-Pakistani border. Captain Mike Texaco Williams had been monitoring close air support frequencies when he'd heard Firebird 77's ammunition expenditure report and calculated her probable fuel state. Without waiting for official authorization, he diverted his aircraft towards Sector 79 Alpha, knowing that bureaucratic approval processes moved too slowly to save a pilot about to crash in hostile territory. Texaco 21, Firebird 77, I am critically low fuel. Repeat, critically low fuel. Request immediate emergency refueling. Nakamura's voice carried the controlled desperation of someone who understood that salvation was being offered with perhaps 90 seconds of engine time remaining. Through her cracked canopy, she could see the distinctive silhouette of the KC-135 emerging from morning haze, its refueling boom already extended like a mechanical lifeline. The aerial refueling that followed violated virtually every safety regulation in Air Force doctrine. Nakamura's damaged A-10 was leaking hydraulic fluid, flying with compromised control surfaces, and operating so close to fuel exhaustion that a missed connection would result in immediate engine failure. The Stratotanker crew knew they were risking their own aircraft to save a pilot they'd never met, but in the unwritten code of military aviation, you didn't abandon someone who'd expended everything supporting ground forces. Firebird, you're cleared for emergency contact, Captain Williams transmitted. Take all the fuel you need. We'll worry about the paperwork later. His matter-of-fact tone couldn't disguise the precision required to mate two aircraft when one was barely controllable, and both were operating in airspace that contained hostile surface-to-air missiles. The connection was achieved on the first attempt, a testament to Nakamura's skill and the Stratotanker crew's professionalism. As JP-8 jet fuel flowed into her nearly empty tanks, she felt her aircraft's performance characteristics return to normal parameters. Warning lights that had been screaming emergencies began cycling back to green, and her engines settled.